Hey everyone, Richard from Digital Foundry here, and I have convened the Digital Foundry team for a truly momentous occasion. Today, on the Wired website, it was revealed PlayStation 5, or as Mike Sony is calling it, the next generation console, presumably from Sony. And joining me to talk about it, I have from Frankfurt, John Linneman.
Hey Rich, how's it going today? I'm reporting live on the latest from PlayStation 5.
Everything is fantastic, but that's not all. We are going to be going straight over to Berlin, of all places, where we find Alex Battaglia.
Hey Rich, you know that dues ticker thing? We're live here in Berlin.
Yes.
Do we have a Peter O'Hanrahan on the line as well?
Lichten.
Right, okay, well, to business. PlayStation 5, Mark Cerny, Wired. Where do we begin? I guess we start with the specs. We'll go over each of these points in turn, but we have a third generation Ryzen CPU cluster, which is going to be based on the Zen 2 core, 8 cores there. A GPU based on Navi, and there's talk of ray tracing support. The big surprise, I guess, was a massive solid-state storage drive with enormous bandwidth and backwards compatibility. So I guess we'll start with graphics, which would be Navi. And well, John, what do you make of this?
So yeah, we've been hearing a lot about, the upcoming AMD architecture there, and even though it still seems to be based on GCN, which is a little bit concerning, but they seem to be focusing more on sort of pixel pushing power, so we'll see how that plays out. It is kind of what we expected, I think, but just dropping the word ray tracing in there is interesting because, I mean, you could theoretically, of course, run it through software using like compute units. We've seen that before, right? I mean, there's the Crytek demo, there's other examples of this working. So it is a possible thing, but I'm wondering if there's also some sort of ray tracing focused hardware in there, maybe, possibly. I don't know if they can do it while keeping the cost down, but at the same time, we've seen what you can do with more limited ray tracing in software, basically, if you keep your frame rate target at a reasonable level. So I feel like if they're targeting 30 frames per second, it starts to become more realistic, especially, if they keep the settings in sort of a reasonable area. And it's good for the industry in general, I think, as well, to focus on this kind of thing. So that's kind of the most interesting for me, other than the fact, so yeah, it's what I thought, but with a little extra.
Right, so Alex, you are the man with reflected, ray-traced, dynamic, muzzle flash shadows in your eyes. You are Mr. Ray Tracing. What is your thought on this?
Well, the first thing that I'm more curious actually about is what exactly Navi is, because looking at AMD slides kind of preparing for this discussion, we don't actually know much about it, and other than the rumor of it being possibly less compute focused and more about pixel pushing power, basically. The problem with GCN in the past has always been that to extract most of its performance, it required either like a high bandwidth to kind of feed those compute units, or usage of asynchronous compute, because normally most of the chip was sitting idle. And that did obviously require more to the metal, coding from programmers and from game developers alike. And I'm curious actually if Navi is kind of more, I would almost say NVIDIA-like, in the fact that it has more easily extractable performance. I would hope so, because that just means much easier development for developers in general, and also we can see games coming out looking better quicker, instead of waiting towards the end of the generation when devs have to spend basically more time tailoring a game engine to their architecture of the GPU. But beyond what in the heck possibly Navi could be, ray tracing is interesting, because I honestly still don't think that there's probably going to be dedicated ray tracing hardware in it, mainly because it kind of came out of left field when NVIDIA initially announced the RT core as being part of the Turing architecture. I didn't expect it at the time. I don't think a lot of people did. And I don't think maybe necessarily AMD did as well. So I don't know if that'll be on there. Rather, like John was saying, we've seen it being proven already that it's possible through basic compute units to do ray tracing in a limited fashion with reasonable targets for frame rate and reasonable targets for resolution. And those are also kind of like really nascent implementations of ray tracing. Games developed for it, from the get-go are going to be doing it in a much more probably efficient manner, and one that also looks generally good no matter what they do. They're going to spend time making it look right if they do use it. But it obviously won't be possibly as performant as something like we would see on an RTX 2080 or 2080 Ti. So I think the name dropping though of ray tracing, the way it was phrased in the article was a little strange, because it talks about a customized GPU and then ray tracing is kind of dropped in originally with some strange comparison to some $10,000 or $20,000 US workstation as being the only thing that could possibly do ray tracing. I think there's obviously, with them announcing it so early, there's a lot of buzzwords going around right now regarding next gen technology and things like that. And perhaps even if it's not ray tracing like we know it on Turing, getting that word out there that it can support it at least makes it seem super next gen in general. Because the line thereafter in the article on Wired actually mentions something that is already being done to a certain degree and is not computationally actually as expensive as visual ray tracing is, which is using it for audio, figuring out where audio could be bounced around in the scene of geometry. That is, since it doesn't actually have the rendering portion of the graphics there, it's not as expensive. So that being name dropped curiously after the mention of ray tracing makes me wonder if it's already trying to, I don't know how you say, keep people's expectations in check. Maybe it won't be like this, not everything's going to be ray traced kind of thing. That's the kind of way I see it right now. But I'm excited though, because like John said, getting more developers to use ray tracing is great because we'll see it in more games. And also it massively increases the efficiency of developing games. Instead of spending time baking out lighting or baking out certain effects or spending time to create, I don't know, bespoke solutions, you would just have ray tracing taking care of it. And I like that.
Well, it's also beneficial for low-end PCs, right?
Yeah.
Not low-end, but the mid-range. Not everybody's running RTX cards, obviously. And implementing ray tracing into a console space on hardware that can support that will almost certainly benefit all PC users of a certain class of card, I would imagine. So it would kind of open up ray tracing to the masses. I mean, NVIDIA is already kind of experimenting this with its own extension of support to the previous generation cards.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
In that sense, this is a good thing, I think, for the industry at large.
I think from my perspective, I've got a few notes here. Well, where do I begin? First of all, if you're going to be mentioning ray tracing in what is essentially a reveal of your next generation console, I would be massively disappointed as a developer if there was no hardware assist for ray tracing on the silicon itself. Because fundamentally, if it is a software solution, you could do it on Xbox One X, even PS4 Pro in a very limited fashion. So they're treating this as a part of the new processor, which kind of suggests that there is a hardware cost, a hardware implementation, but at the same time, the silicon area used by RTX to deliver real-time ray tracing is pretty huge, and to dedicate a similar amount of silicon to a console APU, that's pretty daring. So I'm kind of surprised there. Yeah, it's funny you should mention the $20,000 workstation there, Alex, because we saw that in the original version of the Wired article, but it has since been amended to mention NVIDIA RTX cards as well, and they start at $350. Which is a slight difference compared to $20,000 workstations.
That seems like an error on the author's part, maybe, rather than something that Cerny said, I'd say.
So. I would hope so as well. But yeah, obviously they wanted to get that in there. Whether it's a buzzword or not, I'm not sure. But you'd think AMD would be aware of it because Microsoft certainly are, and Microsoft are working with AMD routinely. You know, I'm sure even if they're not talking about Xbox, they would have been talking about DXR on PC. So I'm sure there is some kind of, you know, knowledge and momentum for ray tracing there. In terms of the GPU generally, again, Alex hit the nail on the head there. We know virtually nothing about Navi, nothing at all. There was a leaks benchmark which suggested that it was, you know, delivering higher gaming performance than expected, and the inference was that, you know, maybe compute is suffering as a consequence, but we just don't know. I think it is a GCN architecture, a latest revision of GCN, which would limit us to 64 compute units, I suspect, unless that limitation has been overcome. And well, I've got a few more notes about the graphics and the GPU, which we'll do in a new video, I guess, because it's sort of out of the range of this one. But again, I think what's quite interesting is that they didn't mention anything about compute power, and it sort of says to me that they kind of, it may well be in their interests to not be in the teraflop war that we had with the Pro and the Xbox One X. And if the rumors are true of a 4 teraflop entry-level Scarlet machine on the Xbox side, which I believe is actually accurate, then Microsoft probably won't be indulging in any sort of teraflop war marketing this time around as well. So yeah, that's what I think of the GPU side of things. And yeah, the ray tracing thing, interesting. I hope it is some kind of hardware acceleration on there because well, you know, I think we kind of need that momentum. But I guess we should move on to the other thing, which is great news. Zen 2 Core Ryzen 3rd Gen technology, 7 nanometer confirmed, which is awesome. And what they actually included, which surprised me and which makes me very happy and backs up one of my theories from last year, is that they would actually be going for 8 full cores and by extension 16 threads. So John, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, that is tremendously good news. I think there were some concerns we had previously as in regards to which CPU might be in the box.
We did hear a very, very, how could we put it, distressing rumor that it would be like another iteration of Jaguar, possibly for cost saving, possibly for back-compat ease for Sony to implement. But, you know, they've come out, they've said it, it's Zen 2. It's you know, basically the latest architecture that AMD can deliver, which is awesome. And
that's fantastic news, I think, for this, because the CPU has proven to be a significant bottleneck this generation, I think, especially when you look at the sort of upgraded consoles. I mean, the GPU in Xbox One X is excellent, and you know, it's solid enough in the Pro as well, but the CPU has continued to be an issue, and I think that's where we've run into issues in terms of hitting high frame rates, especially in more complex games. So, you know, obviously id Software has been able to squeeze out 60 frames per second in their more focused titles, but I think that's been a huge bottleneck, and it's something that's continued to impact the consoles this generation throughout. So jumping over to, I guess, the most recent upcoming iteration of Ryzen, that's great news for the product as a whole, and I suspect we'll be seeing pretty much the same thing in the next generation Xbox as well, which would make a lot of sense. But you know, when these previous generation machines were developed, there really wasn't a better option than something like Jaguar, I suppose, at least from AMD, right? Like, so AMD itself has come a long way. Ryzen was a huge product for them, and it's a very capable CPU. So I think that alone means a lot for the consoles, and I'm kind of curious to see where they're going to attempt to clock the CPU at, like if there's going to be a clock speed war between the next consoles. But I mean, you know, that how else will you differentiate? It's, you know, on that front, we'll have to wait and see. But how much do we actually know about Zen 2 right now? anyways?
I mean, we're going to be seeing, presumably, I would imagine, greater clock speeds in general due to the die shrinkage. But in terms of IPC, as in the amount of single-threaded performance, I would imagine if it's going to be kind of Intel TikTok-ish, it could be like 10% better or something like that. But I think the interesting thing then is if it is Ryzen and we have all these threads, what is the actual core clock they'll be using for this? Because Ryzen is it's okay in terms of power efficiency, but we're talking about a limited, on a console on this SoC right next to also presumably a power-hungry GPU that is going to be giving off heat as well. I'm curious how modest they are with the clocks versus I would say maybe the desktop components that it is actually extracted from.
The 7nm shrink should help quite a bit, I'd imagine.
Well, my first rule of leaked console specs is always expect something slower than what you think it's gonna be. We'll have to see about that, but I just think it's the fact that we've got 8 full Ryzen cores, presumably 16 threads. It's a bit of a game changer. The other thing, I mean, the implications here for PC gaming are quite frightening as well.
It's huge.
The new baseline is going to be set at 8 cores. Consoles are typically the development target, and I suspect that it will be the same core count on the Xbox as well, which, kind of frightening in a way.
Bad news bears, I guess, yeah.
In addition though, I mean, because of the Jaguar, a lot of developers have become very efficient at utilizing the CPU and the GPU in conjunction. So I feel like this opens up a lot of extra potential that wasn't there before, in the sense that, they're really good at optimizing to run on the very limited Jaguar. So this should be a massive jump. Because, I mean, arguably in many ways, the CPUs in this current generation of consoles were not really a massive leap over, like the PS3 Cell or even the Xbox 360 CPU. I mean, it's a leap, I suppose, but in some ways, especially like the single-threaded performance is not good on the Jaguar, right? So, even though we've raised issues with Ryzen before as a PC CPU, especially in terms of single-threaded performance, it's going to be a game changer for the consoles.
I mean, well, another thing to think about too is they didn't talk about it necessarily, but the memory basically in the console is also going to be very important, as we saw with PS4. I mean, the announcement of 8 gigabytes GDDR5 or whatever was hilarious, in retrospect, but also the speed of that. And just from looking at PC benchmarks, Ryzen, and especially what is it called? The 16-core version of Ryzen. I forget what the name of it.
Threadripper.
Oh, Threadripper also scales incredibly well with memory performance. So if it's actually really fast unified GDDR6, that could also mean impressive Ryzen performance in comparison to PCs, actually. I was just thinking about that right now. But I'm curious to see what they do for the memory attached to that CPU as well.
Well, they didn't mention anything about memory at all, and specifically how much of it there's going to be, which is pretty crucial information. But kind of related to that, I mean, we can expect that there will be more than 8 gigabytes of memory in the next generation PlayStation, which means that, we need a pretty awesome storage solution in order to fill that memory. And this was kind of like the big deal, the kind of game changer that nobody expected. And it is this kind of almost fantastical solid state storage solution, which Mark Cerny says is faster than the fastest PC. So, if you look at something like the Samsung 970 Pro, that's got like a sequential read of like 3.5 gigabytes per second, sequential write of 2.5 gigabytes per second. If it's faster than that, lordy.
That was the one point where I actually had the massive eyebrow raise, mainly because I was trying to think about, because obviously with the PS4, we realized that for the most part, these consoles are going to be sourcing from already existing architectures and things out there. There's no crazy XDR coming out of left field, or there's no crazy cell. So I was trying to think about where this came from. And then I was just thinking about, Ryzen 2. that it's also going to be supporting PCIe 4.0, which has yet to be released in the PC space. And if it is an NVMe SSD drive that is basically run through PCIe lanes that are now faster, it makes actually sense that it could be technically, on a technical level, raw bandwidth, more, I guess it would have more throughput than that which is currently out there on PC. But as soon as Zen 2 then releases on PC, it would be the same that is actually already out on PC at that point in time, because PCIe 4.0 would be out at that point.
I guess the implication here is if it is a custom drive, then the user won't be able to upgrade it, which is kind of worrying. But what do you make about this, John?
Well, I mean, Sony has allowed additional storage even on systems with built-in storage. So it's not, I don't think that necessarily rules out the inclusion of a user upgradable drive. We've seen it with like some of their portable systems, like the PSP Go. It has 16 gigs of RAM, but you can still stick in an extra memory card. So, but you know, that's something to think about once it's launched. I do think the announcement of SSD for a console like this is kind of similar to when they announced the 8 gigs of RAM, I suppose you could say. In that, you know, it seems like an expensive solution right now, but at the same time, prices have been coming down on solid state storage, somewhat at least compared to where they were by far. You know, we've really just kind of run into issues with, I think, mechanical storage for modern games. There are going to be limits there, and you see this more on the PC, I think, when, you know, assets are larger and you're using larger textures and you need to fill more memory. I think it's important that you have a very fast storage medium. And they did suggest, though, that there still will be an optical drive, which is great. So I assume it'll still be the installation thing. I wouldn't expect massive gains there in terms of raw installation speed, maybe. But yeah, for actual game usage, being able to load that up will make a difference. And I have to wonder, though, about, I think, Alex, you even mentioned this about using some of the onboard memory as sort of a cache.
Yeah, that was the thing that kind of, it mentioned this SSD speeds kind of in a kind of not telling kind of way, and then described a demo that they had of Insomniac Spider-Man, where the game, it was a little worded in a strange way. Was the game actually loading, or were there two separate demos of the game loading as one demo?
There were two demos. There was one which was a fast travel thing, which essentially is moving Spider-Man from one part of the open world to another.
Okay.
And then there was, they timed it apparently from 19 seconds on the PS4 to 0.8 of a second on the PS5, which is a 19 times increase, which is quite astonishing. And then the second demo, which they were talking about, was essentially that the streaming speed of the traversal through the city is dictated by the hard limits set by the storage. Mm-hmm. And that limit has been removed, so instead of just swinging through the city at Spider-Man speeds, they were able to traverse at jet fighter speeds, which obviously is a bit of a game changer. RAM caching could be a thing. I mean, I think, isn't it the case that pretty much every high-end SSD already has like a DRAM cache on it anyway? Yeah. So it could be a thing. It could be integrated into the system. It would kind of make sense, really, wouldn't it? I mean, Xbox One X has a RAM cache for prior Xbox titles, which helps to speed up loading. So it's not unprecedented. I think the thing that is unprecedented is A, that we're looking at solid-state storage, and B, that it's they're saying that it's faster than anything, which is awesome. But yeah, I mean, I did hear a rumor a while back that it was built around a solid state solution, and it was 1 terabyte in size. Complete, just a story which I never corroborated, but I do worry about the finite level of storage. They must have a solution for that. And expandable storage, you were talking about that, John, but if games are built around a system that can deliver massive bandwidth, then I don't know how you would add more storage to it unless you're going to buy it from Sony and unless it has a bespoke expansion port or something.
Well, they've been known to do this,
Yes.
sometimes for the worse.
Oh, Vita. Yeah.
So that kind of leads us on to the final spec point, which is fascinating, which is confirmation, if it were needed, that PlayStation 5, the next generation Sony console, as they're calling it, will allow you to play PS4 games. It does have back-compat, and you can use PSVR with it, which suggests that there's hardware back-compat as well. So, John, your thoughts?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. One of the comments I've seen floating around after this announcement was, oh geez, I bet there'll only be like 4 PS4 games available at launch. So I think there's some confusion based on the very impressive method that Microsoft is using, which enhances games, and it's more of a wrapper around previous games. If we look at what Nintendo and Sony have both done traditionally on every other console pretty much, save for like the PS4, you know, if they implement the backwards compatibility in such a way that you just use original discs or downloads with the system, there shouldn't be any need to relicense these products and essentially optimize them to work as a new package. You know what I mean? Like this, theoretically, if this works the way they've used it before, it should be as simple as just using your old content as you always did. And although they did add boost mode, so maybe we will see improvements, you know, it's equally possible that the games may just end up running as they used to, or maybe with slight enhancements as a result of that. I mean, Sony did implement enhancements on PlayStation 2, for instance, like texture filtering and faster disc speeds that were optional. So I guess that's where I'm curious to see is, will Sony take their old approach that they used to take before they decided to eliminate this feature? Or will it take more like a Microsoft approach where it has to repackage games and sort of, you know, if you own it, you still get to use it, but it's like they can't just allow you to use all software at once due to the way that it works there. So there's the licensing to jump through. So, and that is also going to be interesting, of course, for Microsoft, because I'd like to think going forward as well that they might, you know, take this approach where Xbox One software just works on the next Xbox, kind of like it does work with the X right now, you know? Like so I feel like
pretty much confirmed that they're going to be doing
yeah, so that's my take on what next generation backwards compatibility is going to be. It's going to be your library is just going to work, and I think that it's a great confirmation from Sony. And the only thing I really would like to see then from there is support for other older systems. They've kind of done this before, and there was even some hints at this in sort of a patent filed, I guess, that left a little bit of confusion as whether they could implement support for like PS1, PS2, or even somehow PS3, right? I'm not sure if it's feasible, but I would like to see that.
Well, that's the thing. I think they would have been much at a loss if they hadn't done it, had backwards compatibility, because Microsoft has shown with this generation that it generates a lot of buzz, it generates a lot of goodwill. If you do support, I would say Xbox 360 titles like Microsoft has, or even those rare original Xbox titles that they have. And that was something where if Sony was going to the next gen without it, it would have been a great plus point for Microsoft. So it takes away that one little bit from the competition at that point. But beyond that, on a technical level, the thing I'm curious about is if there will be Xbox One X style enhancements to PS4 titles. I don't know what we can talk about there, but like I can imagine running Horizon Zero Dawn at a higher resolution or higher frame rate would be on the list of many people's desires. That sounds like something great, and it would be great if you could just pop in your disc into your PS5 of Horizon Zero Dawn, play it at 4K, maybe 60 FPS, maybe even better. That's what I would be curious about, is how much the backwards compatibility is more PC-like, where your old games also run better.
They would have to patch it. That's the bottom line, because the whole engine is built around the capabilities of that hardware, and you know, to the point where they use the spare CPU cycles for streaming in extra environmental data, kind of in a predictive style. So the whole engine of Horizon is built around 30 Hertz. So I do think that they would have to do X-style enhancements. And this actually leads me on to a bit of a concern that I've got in how this was presented in the Wired article, where they were talking about Death Stranding. They were saying it could release on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5, which, okay, fair enough, excellent, no probs.
Okay.
Because then they could produce a game that, you know, would be 30 on one and 60 on the other. However, does that mean that if you buy it on PlayStation 4 and then buy a PlayStation 5, you need to re-buy the same game? Because this isn't the ethos that Microsoft have got with their approach to things as things stand. I mean, I can buy Forza Horizon 4 on the Xbox One, I can play it on the X, and then also, you know, I can play it on PC, and I'm, you know, almost certain that there would be compatibility for an upcoming Xbox if it was supported, you know, so it's basically one release for all platforms. That's kind of the vision that I've seen. Play anywhere, literally, it's called Play Anywhere. And I think that that would persist. So I'm curious if that is going to be a differentiating factor there, whether you'll need to basically, you know, re-buy the game on PS5, whereas you wouldn't on Xbox. I'm hoping that's not the case, because I think Microsoft are really setting the pace there.
We haven't actually seen Sony in this situation before, because in prior generations, during the cross-generation period, you know, the same, well, somewhat the same games are often sold on different platforms, right? You can buy Far Cry 4 on PlayStation 3, or you can buy it on PlayStation 4. You could buy Forza Horizon 2 on Xbox 360 or on Xbox One. They were separate purchases, and it's only this generation where I feel like Microsoft's made their strides towards one piece of software for multiple platforms, but only for digital titles. And that's where I'm kind of wondering as well, like if they adopted this strategy, how would this impact the disc? Like theoretically, I feel like it would be possible to include a flag or extra data or something to make it so your retail Death Stranding disc could run on PS5 or PS4, like, you know, both versions on one disc, or would it, you know, because the only reason that I think it's that way, the way it is on Xbox and Windows Store, is because, well, I mean, there's not, you know, the Windows Store is the Windows Store, and I don't really think there's any support for physical media anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
But between two console platforms, there absolutely should be. I'm sure they'll both use Blu-ray disc, unless they move to like the larger UHD Blu-ray style discs, maybe.
Right.
But
which would require two physical discs.
it would, yeah, exactly.
Fascinating stuff, yeah. I mean, I've actually got some notes on this, because I actually talked to Mark Cerny about it. Yeah, this was the PlayStation 4 Pro briefing, and basically the discussion was about why, I suspect that the discussion was about why Jaguar was still in the PS4 Pro, because at that point everybody knew about Ryzen. It's like, well, if you're producing a quote-unquote super-powered PlayStation 4, why not use a better CPU architecture? And two major points that came up. First of all, there was the issue of compatibility even between x86 processors, and there's this kind of theory that in a multi-core setup, if you assign parallel workloads, one core might finish ahead of the other core, purge the memory which the other core still needs to access, and it causes all manner of potential issues there. And this is why the Pro had a base mode. It was literally a base mode that made the Pro almost physically into a base PlayStation 4. So, you know, you had that butterfly GPU and whatnot. They were obsessed with getting absolutely perfect compatibility there. This is an entirely different undertaking. They've got a completely new GPU. They've got a completely new CPU. So, you know, if we look at what Microsoft has done, they've got a massive backwards compatibility team with 100 testers. You know, this is a massive investment that I think Sony would need to replicate. Secondly, I think there has possibly been a shift at Sony, because when I spoke to Mark Cerny, he was talking about PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro being in the same family, in the same generation, and when they moved on to the next generation, which, you know, they wanted to fully embrace as a proper generational leap, they wanted to see it as a clean break from the past. But when you've got like 90 million, it'd probably be 100 million installed user base by the time the generation's over. It would be madness to leave those people behind. You've got to bring them on board, and the way to do that essentially is backwards compatibility, especially with Microsoft setting the pace there.
So one thing about that though is this kind of brings to mind the patent filings that popped up in the news a month or so back, where it was very specific about simulating the way the hardware worked with specific software to sort of recreate that original environment, which to me starts to suggest that they're just focusing on simulating what the PS4 does rather than like an enhanced approach to it. Because it does sound like they're concerned with the way that the different CPU threads might be used. They want to ensure compatibility by really simulating the hardware, and the answer we're looking for might be kind of sprinkled in there to a degree.
I guess we're sort of going to be rounding this off soon, because that's pretty much everything that we know about the next generation PlayStation based on the reveal. But the question I've got for you, John, is why now? Why announce now?
My best guess, honestly, is that I feel like Microsoft probably has something brewing and ready for E3, but then there's also, I saw some thoughts floating around suggesting that, hey, if Sony planned to launch this in 2020, there's going to be huge expenditures coming over the rest of 2019. It's kind of like at least letting investors and other people it's like, here's a heads up, like we're working on this big project, it's going to cost a lot of money. We also think maybe the competition has something up their sleeve. It's like let's get out in front of this a little bit. Like they're just sticking their toe in the water, It's like Microsoft's probably going to end up going first this time, whereas Sony kind of technically went first with the PS4 reveal, because I wouldn't really consider this a reveal so much as just like, it's more like, hey, this exists, we're working on it, here's a little tiny taste. So I'm sure it's a mix of all those things, like investors heading off the competition, just starting to build the hype train that, it's just, that's part of consoles, right? So I'm sure it's all of those things combined in some way.
I think actually the hype train thing is perhaps bigger than the investor or even heading off Microsoft part, because that article on Wired, it's written in this way where it seems almost like, I joked about it, but like Sony whispering things in the background, and there's like interpreters at Wired trying to get across what it's about, because it is actually not that revealing beyond the SSD, I would say. Those were all things that we kind of expected for the most part. The SSD was the one thing that I wasn't actually ever positive of, and all these words are kind of thrown in there that we've heard about Ryzen, what it can do. We've heard about ray tracing. Backwards compatibility is on everyone's mind, and getting that out there, it starts getting that cycle of emotion up about what next gen could be.
Yeah, but have you heard about 8K?
Oh God, we didn't even talk about 8K. Please, devs, do not target 8K in your games for next gen. There.
Unless it's Geometry Wars.
Yes. Run that at 16K.
Well, that's actually an interesting point, because 8K, assuming it's a 60 hertz variant, it's HDMI 2.1, which means that in theory the bandwidth is there for 4K at 120 hertz, and in theory there'll be variable rate refresh rate support, FreeSync if you like, which both of these things I find deeply exciting and want to have in a console. And we know that Microsoft obviously has been experimenting with both of those things on current generation hardware, but I just really hope that that Sony embrace it too with their next generation machine, because I find both of those things a lot more exciting than 8K, which would probably be 8K upscaling.
It also makes the dream of ray tracing on next generation hardware that much more realistic, because if you have variable refresh rate and you're targeting an unlocked 60, I guess if you're above maybe like between 48 and 60 or so, it looks really great already.
Assuming you have a FreeSync display.
Assuming you have a FreeSync display.
Most people probably won't.
Yeah, I guess it does beg the question of how it's supported. If it's like a dashboard support forced across all games like it is on Microsoft consoles, or if there's bespoke modes within the games itself, which seems more like a Sony style thing to do.
Well, I just mean like the TV support isn't there yet. Like it's starting to show up in the market, but it's not. It's only in high-end TVs right now, and only some of them, and it's only just started to appear. I think most displays don't have this. As the generation continues, it'll become more common, but people don't usually upgrade their TV that often. So, and a lot of people just bought into 4K in the last couple years. So, you know, it's a cool thing, but its use, it won't, you know, it'll become more useful as time goes on.
Do you think there's anything here that's going to be worrying Microsoft?
No.
No.
Not really. I honestly feel like I suspect they're both going to have very similar boxes, but after what happened last time, I feel like Microsoft is pretty hungry again. Like I don't know. We'll see what happens, but I suspect that it'll be an interesting battle. But I don't think there's anything to worry about yet, other than maybe the Switch Pro.
The Switch Pro, yeah.
Well, for me, actually, the thing I'd imagine Sony would be more worried about than Microsoft is the infrastructure stuff. Right. So I'm very much into keeping hardware in the home rather than the cloud. But between Google and all that, you know, that seems to be a driving force for this next gen and maybe an optional kind of thing. And Microsoft is poised to deliver on that pretty easily, I think, at this point. They have the resources.
Yeah.
I don't think Sony has those resources, and their networking hasn't been great. So it does kind of feel like, you know, they have to pour everything into this hardware. The physical box is super key to the next generation PlayStation, whereas the physical box is maybe, you know, it's a big chunk of the next Xbox, but it's not the only part.
I think this is a really interesting discussion, is the extent to which Stadia could be a game changer, because it has a state-of-the-art solid-state storage solution with no limits. With, you know, literally, you know, they can draw upon, I think Phil Harrison told me, petabytes of data. So there's that. And, you know, it's got a reasonably powerful CPU, even judged by PC terms, 10.7 teraflops. I can't, you know, much as I'd love to see the next generation consoles deliver 12, 14 teraflops, that's going to be a big call in a small box with a constrained thermal solution. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and then of course there's as you say, John, the whole infrastructure side of the equation, which is that you know, they've got scalable elastic compute there. They've got the ability to have clients and servers peer-to-peer, which, you know, potentially a game changer. And yeah, I'm going to be fascinated to see how this one plays out, because Microsoft, as you say, you know, they do have a cloud infrastructure. The irony is, of course, that PlayStation were there first with streaming in the console space with PlayStation Now, but, you know, I just can't see them rolling out that level of investment to get the kind of blanket coverage that Microsoft and Google basically already have in their back pockets anyway.
Yeah.
So the cloud side of things, what I will say is, of course, that Sony's first party stuff has just been amazing, and given the tools that we've seen today, I'm massively excited by what those teams could do. And at the end of the day, it does all come down to the games, right?
And yeah, actually, I think there's still enough room in the marketplace for all these different players. I mean, PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo are all healthy right now,
Yeah.
doing quite well. And there's a lot of great software coming out of all of them. The competition's pretty good, solid. I honestly don't want to see things change too much in that sense. Like I'm happy that Microsoft is investing in more studios. I'm happy that Sony has its massive selection of first-party studios pumping out amazing games. And of course, Nintendo is doing the same. I mean, that's the stuff that I love the most from these companies. And so I would like to see them all succeed.
Yeah, I'm most excited actually about the software. Due to this new baseline of hardware that's there, we have such a wider CPU that is going to be faster per core, per thread, and the simulation capabilities from that are going to be amazing in comparison to what we see on the Jaguars this current gen. I want to see a sequel to Red Faction Guerrilla. I don't know about you. And also to see what character models look like next gen. Nathan Drake already looks pretty darn amazing. Imagine what he looks like on PS5.
Yeah, next generation Red Faction. I don't think anybody else would have proposed this as their next gen vision. And of course it would be, you know, full path tracing in there as well, I guess.
Next generation chest airs.
Yeah.
There you go.
I mean, that's also going to be after they put out next gen Turok. So.
Okay, well, we're veering into silliness here, so I'm going to wrap everything up. Yes, thank you so much for joining me on this one, guys. And yes, thank you out there for watching this. So please do like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed this content. Ring the bell, of course, please. It really helps us. You'll get instant notifications of every Digital Foundry video that drops. And yes, please do consider the DF Patreon as well if you want to support what we do more directly. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.